I am with Professor Douglas Bushman of the Augustine Institute, and if you watch the 3-minute interview, you're probably asking, why are you doing another one of these interviews, Peter? And that's because we're going to do something I don't normally do, a long interview, because frankly, what you had to say today deserves something long. And I want to start, as you're the chair of the New Evangelization, for those who didn't watch the first interview, and I noticed the way you built your argument. The people were, we're all here for the Catholic Radio Symposium, and your first of your 3 talks was less about radio and more about building the foundation of faith. And I found that so impressive, that reminding us all that the first thing, without that foundation of faith, what's the rest of it for?
Well, first of all, let me commend you for your perception, which is absolutely correct. If we take our faith for granted, and I don't mean that necessarily in the negative way of completely forgetting about Christ and His church and our faith, but if we just say, well, okay, I've got that, and I can just go on and ask kind of technical questions about Catholic radio and try to do this, then I think we are shortchanging ourselves. You notice then I came all the way back at the end and talked about the passage in John's Gospel, chapter 15, we can only bear fruit if we remain in communion with Jesus. And do we really believe that is the question? Jesus uses the image of planting a seed, and then the farmer goes to sleep and doesn't know how or why, but he wakes up and something's happened. I think that we tend, as Americans, to play to our strengths. This is a good thing. We put a man on the moon, we liberated Europe from Nazi occupation, we get things done. That's our strength, bringing that to the New Evangelization. A can-do society, that's wonderful. But we have to remember that God does more than we do. And that as much as we are called to pour ourselves into our apostolic work, unless God blesses it, unless we really give Him the glory, then there will not be, we have no right to expect fruit. So it was good to remind people, and as you said, they were very receptive to that. I think they were ready to be reminded. Perhaps some of them were a little fatigued in their apostolic work and needed a little spiritual shot in the arm.
Now, it struck me, it hit me very hard, and one of the things, and 2 of the things actually that hit me, was you talked about Pope Paul VI, who everybody remembers Humane Vitae. In fact, you took a question on Humane Vitae during the second segment, but you mentioned I think it was his first encyclical?
Yes.
And I'm having a brain freeze on the name, but I brought it up on my computer and started to read it. And I'm reading over here how he's talking about, this is of course the mid-60s when he started his pontificate, and he talks about how even though Europe is starting to fall away, that the foundations of their society, of all these good things that they're building on, were built on the Christianity that they had. And as I look at American society today, it's almost as if everyone thinks that all the prosperity, all the hard work, all the ethics that we had came fully formed, and don't realize that there was a Christian, a devout society that built it up, and it was the fruit of that society.
Well, this is absolutely correct. The Christian foundations of Western civilization are incontestable. That's a historical fact. The great experiment now is, can you still have a society that's worthy of human dignity without God? And I think we are not just beginning to see, we're beginning to see how this plays out. Without God, where do you draw the lines? What does human dignity mean? And what's the genuine foundation of human rights? Do states create rights, or do they only acknowledge them and protect them? Well, in the Catholic tradition, it's the latter. But now we have people saying that no, rights are created by and can be taken away by states, and right now it's a scary place to live. So the Christian foundations, and especially the moral foundations that dictate how we treat one another, as these erode more and more, what we're finding is a more and more rampant individualism and less regard for human dignity and human rights. Now, the really scariest dimension of that is the so-called right of women to have abortions, with a complete neglect of any thought about the developing child in a woman's womb. If the elderly through euthanasia are not safe, if the unborn are not safe, then really we have to ask, who is safe?
As I look at society and as I look at, the redefining of words, the changing of truths, and you talked a lot about truth, and I couldn't help but think of the passion when Pilate asks Jesus, what is truth? Because Jesus is saying, I've come to proclaim the truth. And Pilate asks, what is truth? And that question is still being asked, and people don't want to, it's almost as if people don't want an answer.
Well, if there's truth, that means that there are curbs or fences, boundaries to their own will. And so if you live in a culture that exalts human freedom and defines human freedom as license, as constraint from any kind of obligation, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to have to simply deny that truth exists and that it has a claim that it can make on us. And so you can, this helps us really to see what the terms of the cultural crisis are. Is it or is it not a fact that there is a creator, that there's a divine wisdom and a divine love that precedes us, and that because it precedes us, it determines us? Or do we determine our own selves? Now, the Catholic tradition holds, in a kind of interesting way, both. Life is a gift from God, and once it's received, we're responsible for it. Whether or not we will be ultimately happy depends upon whether we're good stewards of this gift. So we don't bring ourselves into existence, we receive the gift of being. But like all gifts, because we are made in God's image, once the gift is received, we can lose it. We can maintain it if we follow God's commands, if we live according to the truth. If we don't live according to the truth, then we're going to lose the gift of freedom. So the other passage is, truth will set you free. Real freedom isn't liberation from truth, it is subordination to the truth.
So if you know the truth, you're free from the confusion, you're free from the falseness that will put you in a position that's going to hurt you.
Well, yes. Medical doctors, if you take a person before medical school, how free is he to set people free from illness? He has to learn a lot of truth about the human body in order to know how to set us free from illness. If your goal is to get to the Olympics, most people go to a coach, especially a coach that's gotten other athletes to the Olympics. The coach knows the truth about working out too much and now you're not advancing, or working out too little, about diet, about rest, about cross-training, and finances. There's no relativism when it comes to finances in the United States. There's a big difference between a 9% return and a 1% return on your investment. And so isn't it interesting that when it comes, here are three areas of American life: sports, finances, and health. People are not relativistic. They know there are experts in sports, finances, and health. They seek them out based on their track record. Yet when it comes to the most important thing, morals and religion, everything's relative. It's really a topsy-turvy culture we're living in.
It's like as if you would use relativism when your car is being fixed. If you just...
Are there good mechanics and bad mechanics?
I've experienced both.
I'll bet everybody has. So what's the difference? A good mechanic is one who, in an economical way, is able to diagnose the problem and fix it. The bad mechanic charges you just as much, and either he doesn't get it fixed completely, or a day or two or a week later, you're back to where you started. So we have no problem saying good doctor, good mechanic, bad mechanic, good financial advisor, bad financial advisor. But then we don't want to use the words good and bad when it comes to religions, when it comes to moral systems. Some moral systems are more worthy of human dignity than others. Some are true and some are not.
Now, one of the things you talked about earlier concerned the value of a traditional liberal arts education. You talked about Shakespeare and all of these writers who withstood the test of time because they talked about the human condition in a way that was always relevant. And I presume that in Shakespeare's time, there were some lousy playwrights that we've never heard of. I presume in Cato's time and all these other people, they were speakers who were lousy. But these people endured, yet there is a drive to get these people out of education. And and I can't help but wonder if it's because they speak to eternal truths. And if you want to get people away from eternal truths, you don't allow people who speak of the eternal situation of a human condition to speak.
I think that's right. I also think that it's a question of another thing that we have to take into account. Because these are eternal truths, because they really explain life, they're not that easy to wrap your mind around. It takes some work, especially if you want to read Shakespeare in the original. You're going to need an interpreter. And Plato, you need a supporting culture. So obviously you can't read it all unless someone's taking you through the alphabet and you've learned your ABCs. And then you got to learn later on in school how to dissect sentences, and you got subjects and predicates and adverbs and adjectives. And many people have done that, but less and less do students today. They haven't been put through the paces. So they don't possess some of the fundamental intellectual tools that are required to grapple with these texts. Then they don't have mentors, teachers, and parents for whom these are valuable pieces. Look, if you really admire someone and you talk to that person and the person says, thank you for your compliments, but listen, I got all that's important to me from Plato or from Aristotle or from Augustine or from the Catholic Church, then you're going to go to those sources. So there's many things. We need an entire culture that is going to be supportive of and asking the kinds of questions that these great works of literature, philosophy, and religion bear witness to. Without that, we shouldn't really be surprised, it seems to me, that people don't take an interest.
Now, you also talked about, and I got a real charge out of it, because I think the thing that has hurt the church, I'm 52 years old, and the thing that's hurt the church the most in my lifetime, from what I can see, is poor catechesis. People, take something and run with it the wrong direction. They, for example, we're going to allow you to sacrifice something else for meat on Fridays. Suddenly, it's misreported and it becomes everybody eats. There's no sacrifice. Suddenly, we don't have to do this. As if all of these catecheses, these things of the church, have not been read, have not been understood at all. And you mentioned as if people. You've talked to people who their catechesis seemed to stop at age 14 once they got confirmed and they had their party. How important is that? What can we do about that?
That's a great question. Here again, I think it's the family and it's the overall culture. My wife and I homeschool all of our children, and I took my children, all 6 of them, read every page of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So it was a 4-year curriculum, basically 1 year for each part of the Catechism. And it's fascinating. So they all finished that either by their 11th grade or 12th grade. Okay, now 3 of my children have graduated from college, 3 are in college. And things are coming up in university life, as you can imagine, that they never experienced before. And what they're discovering is that their 9th, 10th, 11th grade catechesis is not adequate for the kinds of situations that they're encountering and the decisions they have to make as 19, 20, 21, and 22-year-olds. This has been a fascinating thing, and they know that. So when they come home, we have these magnificent conversations because they're having to dig deeper to understand their Catholic faith. When they were in high school, they were far and away always the best educated Catholics in any group, okay? But none of them went to a Catholic university or college.
Okay, you were talking about your children none of them had gone to a Catholic college, and so they're all off, and they were the best educated.
Yeah, in high school, everyone said, how did you guys know all this kind of stuff? And they'd just say, well, we just read the catechism with our dad. And so they had an excellent Catholic catechesis up to that point. What has become clear to them, I knew this was going to happen, without going to Catholic colleges or universities, during these extremely fertile years of a young person's mind, 18 to 22, they're not going to have access to Catholic good courses in theology or even advanced courses in catechesis. And several of them have been Division I athletes, and some of them have majored in sciences, so they're in the laboratories all day. It's not easy to find the time. What they're discovering is that their high school understanding of Catholicism is not adequate for the kinds of situations that they're encountering and the decisions they have to make as young adults. So we are now embarking on a program of spiritual reading and catechetical reading so that they can bring their high school faith up to date as young adults. You can, and they're only 3 or 4 years away from home, okay? Or maybe 5 and 6 in a couple of cases.
Picture someone 30.
One's 28.
No, I'm talking about people who did not have the background that you had.
Yeah, so imagine people not having as good a background and then having absolutely nothing from 14, not 18, until 30s or 40s. This is part of the crisis that we have in the Catholic Church. As a result, there are many people who don't give the church a second chance because they're stuck in their 14 or 15-year-old understanding of the church, and they say, but that church can't help me. And what I want to say to them is, no, it's your lack of understanding of the church that's inadequate. The church herself has all the answers that you need.
And it's funny because one of the things when my parents were, I was very late. I'm the youngest of 5. And so my parents, even though I'm 52, my parents were born in the 20s. And in those days, you had a problem, you went to the priest, you talked to the priest about problem X, problem Y, problem Z, because the priest was dealing with all of these families at all these different stages. He had the experience of the best counselors that you would ever find. And you related a story about psychologists and stuff that it jumped out at me, and they had some priests who were there who had been counseling the psychologists. Where did you get this information? And I thought that was rather amusing. Could you repeat that story?
Sure. This was many years ago. There was a medieval conference, so you had scholars in medieval philosophy and theology together with a group of some contemplative order. I can't remember what it was. And of course, this contemplative order probably has its roots. Perhaps it was, Cistercians, for example. I don't know that it was, but perhaps the order was there because they had their roots in that time period. And as the exchanges went back and forth, these great scholars of medieval philosophy and theology were astounded at the wisdom that these contemplative monks had, and they said, "Where did you get this?" And the fundamental answer was, of course, they do read a lot, but the fundamental answer was they were men of prayer, and they had come to become so familiar with God's ways in the human soul that by knowing themselves so well, they could really know practically all men and have great insight into all of the different states that we experience, whether it's jubilation or desolation, joy or sorrow, fear. If you read the Psalms, they're full of all these different human states. And the person of prayer is going to experience them in the most intense way. And so there was this fascinating kind of genuflection, an admiration for 2 paths to wisdom. One, if I can put it this way, the primarily scholarly, the other, the way of prayer and self-denial and conversion.
Now, one thing that drives me nuts, and it was even happening during your lecture, politically I'm a very conservative person, but I'm also very Catholic, and during the time of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, conservatives and the popes were like this. They absolutely adored the Pope. We have Pope Francis I now, and we have Laudato Si, and I've written 7 or 8 pieces on Laudato Si, and I really like I think that it's getting really ridiculous press from people in terms of how much is being ignored. But a frustrating thing is how many conservatives who would not trust today's media and culture to tell them that water is wet believe that the Pope is some sort of crypto non-Catholic Marxist, as if when Jesus gave the keys to Peter, he gave them conditionally. And could you talk about that a little bit? Because I end up having to address it every single day. People who suddenly think that the church doesn't know what it knew 2 years ago.
Well, that's a very large question, and it would take a very long lecture in order to answer it fully. First of all, let me identify, there is a definite stylistic change with Pope Francis. He seems to have a predilection for really pithy, imaginative, and almost shocking phraseology. All right. John Paul II and Benedict moved in that direction. John Paul II was no slouch, but it was subordinate to kind of a larger project. Whereas Francis uses very strong language. I think this is a little bit off-putting for many people. We are so accustomed to extreme rhetoric in our culture through politics and everything else, and in some ways this kind of sounds like that. But let me say, he's getting a lot of people's attention. We have to ask, what is the message that the rhetoric is at the service of? In Laudato Si, it seems to me that the overarching challenge for us is for us to come to grips with the responsibility that God has given to us for our own lives, and that's going to involve how we relate to planet Earth. That seems to me an absolutely unassailable, perfectly legitimate point to make, and he makes it actually several times. So there's a first point to make. There's a difference in style between his pontificate and the prior two pontificates. The second point is that he also comes from a quite different fundamental cultural experience of the church, South America rather than Europe. And I think that we have to look at what he's writing, especially when he makes comments about the economy. Every time any pope makes a comment about a political system or an economy, we have to remember what the church says. She says that she herself is not an expert in politics or economics. Her interest is in human dignity. When she looks at economies, when she looks at political regimes, she's asking, is everything that we know about human dignity, human freedom, and human responsibility and human rights, are all of these being safeguarded, respected, and promoted? That's her interest. And so when a politician in the United States would say, I don't take my policy from my bishop or the bishops or even the Pope, he's absolutely right. The church herself says, nor should you. What the politician, the economist should do is look to the church for overarching anthropological truths. That's truths about the human person and about human dignity. That's the church's interest. Are human beings going to flourish according to God's vision for them under certain types of political and economic systems? Once you understand that, then you can read through all of the social teaching of the church, including this most recent document, and see what the church is trying to do. Anytime she makes a particular judgment, then people who are experts are free to say, but wait a minute, maybe you don't understand this or don't understand that.
Well, it seemed to me that the whole message of that encyclical was, we are supposed to be good stewards of the earth, but you also cannot be a good steward of the earth if you can't love the earth and be a good steward of the earth if you're not a good steward of your neighborhood, if you don't love your fellow man.
Yes, that's one way he put it. And he reversed the order in another place. He says you can't love your fellow man unless you have the right relationship with the earth.